This is London, one of the largest and most successful cities on Earth.
Wow. Its story spans 2,000 years of daring invasions, catastrophic fire, heroic ambition, and astonishing technological transformations. From the Romans to the Tudors, from the Vikings to the Victorians.
For years, this was the capital of the world, ruling over an empire of billions. So how did London rise up from an uninhabitable marshland to become the thriving 21st century city we see today?
In this series, we'll reveal the crucial events that changed the very shape and size of London. I'll be digging down into the latest research to uncover conflict, betrayal, and power politics.
I'll be getting special access to some of the city's most extraordinary sites.
And I'll be exploring the innovation and engineering brilliance that gave rise to London's most famous landmarks.
So join us as we go on an amazing journey.
Absolutely brilliant.
To discover exactly how this incredible city was created. Hidden beneath the busy streets of London is the biggest construction site in Europe. Crossrail, the massive new railway being built across the capital. And these miles of newly dug tunnels are offering us something very special, an unexpected window into the history of London. You can't really see it now because those walls have been concreted over, but up there, about 1.5 meters below ground level, archaeologists discovered 19th century Victorian foundations and sewers. And as an army of archaeologists moved in, even more layers of the city's past were uncovered. About 3 meters under the ground, they found a 16th, 17th century burial site, including 3,000 skeletons, some of which belonged to people who died of the Great Plague. 4 meters down, well then, you found artifacts from the time when Westminster Abbey was being built. Their discoveries took them all the way back to the very birth of London. Finally, 6 meters below ground level, evidence from the time when this extraordinary city of London was just a small Roman settlement on the banks of the River Thames. And that's where our story of London starts, in the year 55 BC. I'm just outside London in the marshes of Essex. Now, 2,000 years ago, this is what the city of London would have looked like. A marshy embankment by the slow-moving River Thames in the southeast corner of a place that ancient explorers used to call the Britannic Islands. In the 1st century BC, Britain was seen as a wild country, full of mists and rain, inhabited by ferocious warrior tribes ready to defend their land. But that wasn't going to put off the superpower of the time, Rome. The first Roman to come to Britain was the great general and future emperor Julius Caesar. In his eyes, any unconquered territory was ripe for the taking, and that meant invasion. He actually came here twice, first on a fact-finding mission in 55 BC, and again the next year, this time bringing 25,000 soldiers. But even Caesar, one of Rome's most successful generals, was defeated by this savage island. Caesar was famous for saying, "I came, I saw, I conquered." But on this occasion, he didn't actually conquer very much. Terrible storms and fierce opposition forced him back across the Channel. The ancient Britons had won, for now. But 100 years later, in 43 AD, the Romans were back. This time, they meant business. They invaded with an army of 40,000 men and even brought war elephants. Defeat was not an option. Within just a few years, huge swathes of Britain had fallen to Roman rule. When those first Romans marched up the River Thames towards present-day London, they immediately realised the potential of this vast tidal river. It provided a spot far inland, deep enough to safely harbour their ships. The Romans settled at the point where the estuary narrowed. And by 47 AD, 4 years after they arrived in Britain, a small town had been established. It was no more than a few wooden buildings spread over a quarter of a mile along the river, on the site of today's financial centre, the City of London.
The River Thames has played a crucial role in the story of London. And one of the first things those original settlers built was a bridge. Today's London Bridge is a major route connecting the south with the north of the capital, and it's built at one of the oldest crossing points over the Thames. 2,000 years ago, the Romans built their bridge right alongside here. There's nothing left of the original structure today, but I want to find out from archaeologist Jane Siddell why they chose to build their bridge here.
They settled on this side and they settled on that side, so that's why they had to have the bridge, and this was the most logical place to build it. It was narrow, it worked for navigation, and it worked for their settlement.
And so the Thames would have been key to the success of that
Absolutely.
Roman settlement.
We often call it the heart of London. It is. London wouldn't have been here without it. You could not have built a Roman city without water transport.
The new bridge was a triumph of Roman engineering. Well, where we're stood right now is pretty much on the line of the bridge, is it?
It doesn't run parallel with modern London Bridge, which is just behind us. It actually runs at an angle, right where we're standing, and then up to the other side of the monument.
I mean, that is enormous.
Absolutely
that was a
huge.
long, long bridge.
You're talking thousands of trees that would have had to be felled to create this.
Incredibly, like Tower Bridge today, the Roman bridge could open up to allow large seagoing ships to pass through.
There'd have been a winch system.
And that would have been manually turned
Yep.
to gradually lift.
Yeah, and the weight would have been enormous.
That was state-of-the-art engineering,
Fantastic
wasn't
site, absolutely fantastic site. And it would have been part of the almost the welcome to London. This is a city that's in your face. We want people to come from around the empire. We want to impress them. We want to say, we are here, this is Britain.
Remarkably, this crossing point chosen by the Romans would be the site of London's only bridge for the next 1,600 years. The building of the bridge marked the moment that the Roman Empire decided to make their new settlement here permanent. They designated the port as an emporium, a place where merchants and businessmen from right across the empire could meet. And they called it Londinium. Over the next 10 years, this busy trading centre boomed. New wharves for ships to dock were built along the riverbank, and the population grew to an estimated 10,000 people, both Romans and native Britons.
But just as Londinium was starting to find its feet, it faced a threat to its very existence. In 60 AD, it was almost wiped off the map. The architect of London's downfall is one of the most famous women in British history. She came from an ancient British tribe, the Iceni.
I remember my father bringing me here and telling me the story of Boudica, the warrior queen of the Iceni who wreaked revenge on the Romans. And it's a testament to her enduring appeal that here, outside the Houses of Parliament, there is a statue to her, in image of a woman who scared the living daylights out of those in power.
Boudica's reign of terror began after the death of her husband, the king of the Iceni, when the Romans made a grab for his land, ransacking the countryside, flogging Boudica and raping her daughters.
She decided enough was enough. She and her army of 100,000 men launched a vicious attack on the Roman strongholds of Britain, St Albans, Colchester and London, by then a flourishing centre of trade, and burnt them all to the ground. some 70,000 inhabitants were slaughtered.
The fire in London burnt for days, reaching temperatures of over 1,000 degrees Celsius.
The devastation was total. The evidence of the destruction can be seen in the fact that deep under the modern city is a thick layer of charred earth, up to ½ a metre deep.
Rome's glorious new trading centre lay in ruins. More than 10 years of work had been reduced to ashes. If London was to survive Boudicca's onslaught, it needed help.
Would Rome rescue Londinium? The future of the city hung in the balance.
London, 60 AD, was a burnt-out ruin, brought to its knees by the British Queen, Boudica. But the Romans fought back. This new trade hub on the Thames was too valuable to lose. They sent in troops to defend the city and set about creating a new Londinium from scratch. But how quickly could the city recover from such a devastating blow?
I'm in the heart of the city. Just around the corner is the Bank of England. And here in 2013, archaeologists made a major discovery that revealed extraordinary new evidence about what was happening in Londinium after Boudica's revolt. They were working on a huge 4-year excavation, exploring the land just over there. And what they found was incredible. Preserved in the thick, damp mud were some of the most important artifacts ever to be found from early Roman London.
Ancient messages scratched onto wood. Incredibly, they found over 400 of these writing tablets, common in Roman times, but up until now, only a precious few were thought to have survived.
L.A.
The wood was covered in beeswax, and the Romans wrote on it with a stylus.
They would cut right through and they'd cut into the wood, and what we're reading are the scratches they left behind.
Historian Dr. Roger Tomlin has been studying these fragments of writing.
Presumably these are some of the earliest handwritten documents for Britain that we have.
Yes, they are arguably the earliest.
There's even the first ever reference to London, an address. And one of them, dated 80 AD, gives us clues to what was happening just 20 years after Boudica's revolt.
This tablet, it's addressed to someone called Tertius, and then he's described as a Braceario. He's a Brachiarius, so he's either a maltster or a corn chandler or a brewer. And I think personally he's a brewer.
So that means that business and trade has been set up again, brewing is happening in London, and that we absolutely have evidence of it being sold.
Yes.
But what's really amazing is just how quickly the city got back on its feet after the revolt in 60 AD.
We have another tablet which is dated, I think, the 21st of October, 62, which two businessmen contract to deliver 20 loads of foodstuffs from Verulamium to London.
So it's up and running again within a few years?
Within perhaps 1 year, 2 years, yes. London can take it.
That's amazing. Londinium bounced back and became not just a centre of trade, but of politics, law and finance as well. But in just decades after the first Roman soldiers and merchants arrived, this trading emporium had become the capital of the Roman province of Britannia. This city was going places.
Roman London now embarked on a major period of regrowth. It reached its height in the early 2nd century, with buildings covering the area of today's City of London.
Londinium was no poor relative of Rome. Here in the heart of the City of London, you would have seen large stone-built public buildings just like those you'd have found in any other great Roman capital.
In 120 AD, the city's leaders completed a set of massive government buildings on the site of the present-day Leadenhall Market.
Where I'm standing now was once right in the middle of the biggest building in Londinium. the Roman Basilica and Forum, joined together in one vast network. The Basilica was like a town hall with law courts. The Forum contained shops, offices, and a large open-air marketplace.
The whole complex took 30 years to build and was the largest construction outside of northern Italy. Its footprint was more than twice the size of today's St. Paul's Cathedral. I've been told you can see some remains of this amazing monument if you know where to look. Apparently, I need to explore deep down below modern London, in the most unusual of places, underneath this barber's shop.
Wow, that is pretty amazing. It's the first time I've been into any hairdresser, I think, and seen something 2,000 years old. That's all that remains of one of the basilica's original arches. But when you look at it, it makes you wonder just how many more treasures of Londinium are hidden underground.
Archaeologists have been hard at work throughout modern London's building boom to unearth whatever remains they can before new foundations hide them forever. And that's led to a major discovery, a truly iconic Roman building.
There's one place that says ancient Rome like nowhere else. A place where the blood of humans and animals was spilt for entertainment. The Romans loved horrific spectacle, and in Londinium, it all happened here, the amphitheatre.
Yes, London had its very own amphitheatre, and its foundations lie under the present-day Guildhall. It was built in stone at the start of the 2nd century, right in the heart of the ancient city.
This curved line here traces its outline, giving us just a glimpse of its size. 7,000 Londoners at a time would come here to watch executions, animal fights, and gladiatorial combat. Having an amphitheatre like this really mattered. It showed the world that Londinium was an important Roman city.
It's amazing to think of all those Roman Londoners at work and at play in this grand new city, only 70 years after the first Roman soldiers arrived. Londinium, with all its grand new buildings, was now the place to be. And I'm in search of evidence of the city's growing wealth. In modern-day Billingsgate.
Beneath one of these office blocks lies some incredible archaeological remains that are usually kept under lock and key.
But I've been allowed in to explore the ruins of a large Roman villa built in 190 AD.
Wow.
There we are.
With the archaeologist, Dr. Miles Russell.
This is pretty amazing. What are we looking at?
Well, we're looking at what's left of a Roman townhouse. So it's a big sort of luxuriant Mediterranean style house. Unfortunately, the floor levels have gone. They've collapsed down into the underfloor heating system. So what we're seeing here, all these channels, would be conveying heat under the floor levels.
Underfloor heating. So this is a really fancy house.
It is, absolutely. I mean, it's terraced into the side of the hill, and it's a sort of a riverside apartment. It's got this great view of the Thames. There's a lot of wealth coming into the city, and all these wealthy individuals are spending their money. They are creating their sort of home from Rome, a lovely, luxurious villa-style apartment. The key thing about this structure is what's over here, which is part of their own sort of private bathhouse.
So do you get down here very often?
No, this is not a space where normally you can get access to. The key really is you can see that little arch there. That's part of a stoke hole.
A stoke hole?
You're shoveling or wholesale burning material in through that hole, creating heat like a furnace.
How would this have differed from the public baths, you know, down the road in the city?
They don't have plugs or drains, so the water's only going to be emptied by slaves or servants with buckets on a semi-irregular basis. So if you're swimming in that, you'll be going through like a human soup of skin and hair and unpleasantness. Here, this is your bathhouse, your environment, and you can stay here as long as you like. It's your own controlled environment, and that's what really counts. As the house owner, you're inviting guests in, you're doing business with them, you're striking deals. This is where you're impressing your guests.
It's wonderful to imagine those ancient Romans wheeling and dealing as they relaxed in their exclusive bathhouse. And for another 100 years, more and more people would flock to do business here.
At the dawn of the 3rd century, Londinium had become a crowded city, with a population that had risen to an estimated 30,000. But where did all these people come from?
If you spend a summer's afternoon in central London these days, you'll find it to be a diverse, multicultural city. Perhaps it might surprise you to learn that Roman London wasn't that different. It was a cosmopolitan town filled with people from many different ethnic backgrounds.
And to find out the origin of one of these inhabitants of Roman London, I've come to the Museum of London's storeroom. Here, hidden away inside these cardboard boxes, are the skeletons of more than 500 Roman Londoners. Using the very latest forensic techniques, bone specialist Dr. Rebecca Redfern has made some intriguing discoveries.
Your skeleton records lots of information about where you've lived, what kind of lifestyle you had. So by looking at the bones and teeth, we can figure out what they ate and where they might have come from.
One of the best preserved skeletons in the museum's collection is the 3rd century Lant Street teenager, named after the street in which it was found in 1989.
What do we know about this skeleton?
We know that she's female, but she's 14 years old, and she's from the southern Mediterranean. We know that there are a lot of child migrants in London. There's an 8-year-old child that we found who's travelled all the way from Germany, but she's actually travelled even further.
Evidence from chemicals in her bones indicates she'd arrived here from a different continent entirely.
She's come from possibly North Africa.
Wow. Do you have any theories about who she might have been?
We still think of her as being a child, but in the Roman world, girls often got married at 10 and 12, and so by 14 she may have been married to a soldier. She may have been a slave as well.
Rebecca's research shows that immigrants like the Lant Street teenager were just the tip of the iceberg. Thousands of people would have been transported, either willingly or by force, into London from all corners of the vast Roman Empire.
London becomes this melting pot where people create new communities, and although it's very diverse, they're creating recognisable identities that reflect the multicultural empire.
Londinium had been on an amazing journey in its first 200 years. It had gone from a muddy wasteland to a thriving town, only to be burnt down. But it rose again from the ashes to become a stronger and bigger city, built on a grand scale with massive buildings. But change was coming. The Roman Empire wouldn't last forever. As its enemies grew stronger, London came under threat.
Londinium, 200 AD, a rich city and the capital of Roman Britain. It had come a long way from its boggy beginnings.
What was once a military outpost was now a prosperous port, a flourishing centre of commerce, and the centre of administration for the Roman province of Britannia.
Rome was keen to bolster this key city in the northernmost reaches of its empire. That meant Londinium's biggest and most ambitious building project yet, a city wall. And amazingly, large chunks of this ancient structure are still standing. Now this map shows us where all those remains are, all these red dots. And you can see how it would have enclosed this area in the middle. And it's remarkable how that's been left in place and incorporated into the modern city. Now, I've been told that the most impressive remains are here at Tower Hill, which is why I've come to find out a bit more. I've arranged to meet archaeologist and historian Dr. Simon Elliott, who spent years unlocking the wall's secrets. Now, Simon, I hope you don't mind me saying, but it doesn't strike me as the most impressive Roman structure that I've ever seen.
Well, the first thing to remember is this was the first city wall of this size actually built in the province of Britannia. So for the people living here, it really, really was impressive.
So what size are we talking about? What are the dimensions of the wall here?
Well, it was 6 metres tall when it was built by the Romans, and it was capped with red sandstone, so it would look brilliant from a distance. It would look really, really striking.
And what about the other dimensions? How thick is it?
It's 3 metres wide.
3 metres is an incredible thickness.
Well, it's a very stable wall. I mean, you've got the outer facing here, this is the outer facing. You've got the inner facing, both equally magnificent when built, and then in the middle you've got a rubble core.
This here is outer facing that you can see, is it?
Yeah,
This
absolutely.
Is this original outer facing?
This is original Roman outer facing.
These stones were placed here by the Romans, by Roman hands.
By the Romans.
2,000 years ago.
Absolutely.
London's wall had a lasting impact on the city. It gave it a clearly defined shape. One that remained right into the Middle Ages. And it marked out what's now known as the Square Mile, today's City of London. But there's a mystery. London is built on clay. So where could such huge quantities of stone have been quarried? It took Simon years of detective work, investigating all the abandoned quarries downriver from London. Now he thinks he's found the answer. And it lies 60 miles away in a quiet village in rural Kent. This is someone's back garden, Simon. How come your research brought you here?
Well, in actual fact, you're not looking at someone's back garden. You're looking at the largest man-made hole in Roman Britain and possibly in northwestern Roman Europe. Everything all the way along the sides up there, etc.
What looks like a quiet green valley today, in fact, played a vital part in the creation of Londinium.
Majority of stone which built Roman London came from where you're standing right now.
That's really good to know. That puts a really big smile on my face. Going deeper into the woods, we search out the clues that prove to Simon that this was actually a giant Roman quarry.
There's one of the quarry faces there, look. You can see it right there, right in front of you.
So that is...
That vertical bit is a quarry step.
That's the rock face?
That's the rock face. So that is the actual rock face that the Romans would have worked on. So here, what you can see are pieces of stone physically extracted by the quarry workers.
And Simon's found more proof in the distinctive shape and size of these rocks. They're exactly what he'd expect to find in a Roman quarry. All of these big stones would have been Roman quarried out and just left here.
This is ready-to-use stone. This is the Roman equivalent of sort of an IKEA flat-pack piece of furniture. This would be broken down into smaller pieces and then turned into masonry. So this is the effect of 1,800 years' worth of weathering and wear in an abandoned quarry.
Just 5 miles away, at a modern quarry, workers are still digging out the very same seam of stone that the Romans used. This is fantastic.
The big difference in the Roman period was there'd clearly be no automation whatsoever. So the place will be swarming with thousands and thousands of workers.
These workers had to dig out by hand the 86,000 tons of stone needed to build Londinium's wall. And it took nearly 2,000 boat journeys to transport all that stone back to the city, along the Thames. Who were these people who were doing this backbreaking work, these unskilled labourers?
If you were working in a Roman metalla, so a Roman mine or a quarry, you could be slaves, you could be captives from the Roman wars. One punishment was to be condemned to work in the metalla, and follow that through, condemned to work in the metalla to death. You can see this very fine section near Tower Hill Tube Station and you can look at it, but what you often forget is the human story about the people who gave their lives for that stone to be quarried.
But not voluntarily giving their lives.
No.
There was absolutely never going to be any benefit for them in the work that they were doing.
Absolutely not at all.
It was all for the the glory and the power
Of
of
Rome.
the Roman Empire. This is a truly impressive place. But what I really struggle to comprehend is the position of those slaves and prisoners who are tirelessly put to work here under the ever-watchful eye of their Roman captors, who ultimately gave their lives over to the building of a spectacular capital, a capital they'd never get to see.
Londinium's wall, finally completed in 280 AD, was built to impress. But the Roman Empire was becoming overstretched and divided. Its barbarian enemies were gaining strength. During the next century, Londinium became increasingly neglected and vulnerable to invasion.
The Romans had occupied Londinium for almost 400 years, but now much of the army had been redeployed abroad, and in 410, the Roman military gave up on this far-flung outpost of the empire. They packed up and left.
Civilians followed the army and deserted in droves. By the end of the 5th century, the city was an empty ruin, which was left to rot for another 100 years.
2 centuries after the Romans had left, London was a ghost town. But even if London was a bit down at heel, it still boasted this prime location next to the Thames. And by the 7th century AD, a new set of invaders has arrived to take full advantage. Saxon raiders. By 670, these Germanic warriors had swept through southern England. Now they sailed up the Thames, hungry for new territory. And they discovered the same sweet spot on this deep tidal river which had attracted the Romans. But the Saxons settled about a mile west of the ruins of the deserted Roman city in what is now Covent Garden.
Covent Garden today is a buzzing market full of weird and wonderful things to buy. It's used in much the same way as it was in Saxon times. Archaeologists digging under the ground have found shards of pottery and broken glass dating back 1400 years, which suggests that as early as the 7th century, this was a trading centre. The Saxons called it London Wich, which literally means London's marketplace.
And it couldn't have been more different from Roman London. With a population of around 7,000, it was only a quarter of the size, and just a small collection of simple wooden houses. A far cry from the stone buildings and paved streets of the old Roman city. But it was sited by the River Thames, and for the next 100 years, trade blossomed.
London Wich was a prosperous and wealthy spot, and it soon attracted the attentions of another Northern European people. We call them the Vikings.
Once again, the horrors of war and invasion loomed. Saxon London was squaring up for 100 years of bloodshed that would change the city forever. Britain, 850 AD. And London was about to meet its fiercest warriors yet. The Vikings were coming. These ruthless raiders from Scandinavia had rampaged through northern Europe, leaving death and destruction in their wake. The small, undefended town of Saxon London Wich was ripe for the taking.
In 851, a raiding party of 350 Viking ships sailed right up the Thames and plundered London Wich. Pre-warned, many of the citizens had fled, but those who remained were killed, and their houses and shops were burnt to the ground. If the city was to survive, it would need radical action.
The hero of the resistance movement against the Vikings was a man whose name is now legendary in British history, King Alfred. In 886, he expelled a Viking band that was occupying Londonwich. Then he set about reorganising the city's defences.
Londonwich wasn't the capital of Saxon England. The king had appointed Winchester for that honour. But its strategic location on the Thames was so valuable that there was little doubt the Vikings would be back. Alfred needed a bold plan. He found it in the neglected ruins of Londinium. Its Roman walls would provide protection. So Alfred moved the whole Saxon settlement inside the old city. And as he started to build, London was reborn.
As I walk along this street, Cheapside, I'm actually following directly in the footsteps of King Alfred. This road goes from Aldgate in the east to Ludgate just up ahead. And in the 9th century, it was one of the newly designed streets of a place the Saxons called London Burh.
London Burh covered the same area as Old Londinium, but with fewer than 10,000 people, it had only a third of the population of the former Roman town. Meanwhile, the old Saxon settlement of Londonwich was abandoned and renamed Aldwych, or the Old Town. A name that survives today. In the new London Burh, Alfred repaired the old Roman stone wall.
But if anyone thought that was enough to keep the Vikings at bay for good, well, they were wrong. At the start of the 11th century, just 100 years after Alfred's death, they were back. And this time, the battles over London were fiercer than ever.
For the next 50 years, control of London swung between the Saxons and the Vikings. And I'm on the trail of one of the fiercest battles for the city, with historian Dr. Thomas Williams. It took place on the River Thames in 1014. The Saxon king Ethelred was determined to reclaim London from the Vikings. But the Vikings controlled its bridge, key for the city's defence.
The London Bridge itself was fortified. It would have been a timber construction, probably with battlements of some sort and towers, very strongly defended.
But Ethelred launched a daring attack.
Sending his men up the river with grappling hooks and ropes, tying them around the pillars of the bridge, all the while under attack from spears being thrown down and arrow fire, went back down river and dragged these pillars out and sent the bridge crashing into the water.
The Vikings were defeated and fled. But London still wasn't safe. Just across the Channel, another group of fearsome warriors was gathering strength.
They were called the Normans, and the lands they settled in northwest France are what we still call Normandy. Now, their leader was known as Duke William the Bastard, and he was taking a special interest in England. In fact, he thought he was its rightful king. In 1066, he assembled a large army and invaded.
It was the biggest military force Britain had seen since the Romans 1,000 years before. William defeated the Saxon king Harold at the Battle of Hastings. And with Harold dead, he headed straight for London. On Christmas Day 1066, William was crowned king in Westminster Abbey.
William soon discovered that invading England was the easy part of conquest. Securing it would be much more difficult. So he ordered the construction of heavily guarded castles up and down the country. The most impressive of them all was here, the Tower of London.
William's imposing fortress, the White Tower, still stands today. His original square keep has been added to by a succession of monarchs to create one of the most famous and recognisable castles in the world.
cream-coloured stone William used was imported from his home region of Normandy, and it was chosen because it gleamed when the sunlight hit it, making it visible for miles around.
And then there were the defences, ramparts more than 4 metres thick at the base and soaring almost 30 metres into the sky. William brought in stonemasons from Normandy to construct his tower. They made a statement fortress fit for a king.
The whole project took 20 years to complete, and when it was finished, it was an unmistakable statement of Norman power right on London's doorstep.
William died before he could see his tower completed, but he left behind an extraordinary monument to power and oppression. Its most famous features, the onion-shaped domes, were added during the reign of Henry VIII. But the original fortress was so impressive, it would have scared the native Londoners into submission.
The finished building completely dominated the city of London beside it. This was the tallest building that Londoners had ever seen, like an 11th century shard, only garrisoned with foreign soldiers.
William's new fortress became the stronghold for a dynasty of Norman kings which would last almost a century. Life under Norman rule brought stability and meant Londoners could get back to what they were good at: trade. The city grew behind its walls, and by 1250, the population had risen to nearly 80,000, surpassing the levels of its Roman heyday. And once again, it became the undisputed capital of England, replacing Winchester. London was set on course for a bright future.
But in the next chapter of the city's extraordinary story, the population is struck down by a deadly disease.
The Tudors take over and construct the greatest buildings Europe has ever seen.
The population explodes, and Elizabethan adventurers put London at the centre of a growing new empire.
This is London, one of the largest and most successful cities on Earth.
Wow. Its story spans 2,000 years of daring invasions, catastrophic fire, heroic ambition, and astonishing technological transformations. From the Romans to the Tudors, from the Vikings to the Victorians.
For years, this was the capital of the world, ruling over an empire of billions. So how did London rise up from an uninhabitable marshland to become the thriving 21st century city we see today?
In this series, we'll reveal the crucial events that changed the very shape and size of London.
I'll be digging down into the latest research to uncover conflict, betrayal, and power politics.
I'll be getting special access to some of the city's most extraordinary sites.
And I'll be exploring the innovation and engineering brilliance that gave rise to London's most famous landmarks.
So join us as we go on an amazing journey.
Absolutely brilliant.
To discover exactly how this incredible city was created. Our story began with London's Roman origins.
This is original Roman outer facing.
These stones were placed here by the Romans 2,000 years ago.
Absolutely.
Then, after bitter invasions by the Saxons and Vikings, the city emerged triumphant as the country's capital.
In this chapter of the story, we'll track how London transforms yet again. As we travel from medieval London,
Oh, wow.
to Tudor London and the reign of the unforgettable Henry VIII.
Few eras can have had as much of an impact on London as the one at which we've arrived today. In our journey to map the capital's evolution, we're now at the 13th century. London was about to become one of the world's greatest cities, an esteemed centre of power that would dominate Europe and beyond.
It was now a city of 80,000 people and the capital of the country. But it was split into two competing areas. To the east there was the walled city, originally built by the Romans. Here merchants controlled the purse strings. And over in the west, 2 miles upriver, was Westminster, owned by the monarchy.
This small piece of land outside the walled city of London had become incredibly important in the story of our capital. There was a large stone church here, known as Westminster, to distinguish it from St. Paul's Cathedral in the east.
And this is how it looks today. Westminster Abbey is one of the most recognisable landmarks in London. It was built to tower over the capital, like a billboard to advertise the king's royal authority and to lord it over the merchants in the east.
Isn't it extraordinary? But imagine coming here in the Middle Ages when your house was, what, 2 stories, maybe 3 stories high? This is 5 or 6 times higher. People would have been stunned and amazed.
To tell me more about why it was built, I'm being shown around by the country's foremost expert, Professor David Carpenter.
Wow, it is incredible in here. So beautiful.
It was designed to be. It was designed to be the most magnificent church in the world.
And who was it designed by?
It was designed by King Henry III.
How much money did he spend on it?
Henry III spent about 2 years' annual revenue of the whole kingdom on this church. £50,000, it doesn't sound very much now, but it was billions and billions of pounds. And you can see why it was so expensive, because there's decoration everywhere. Colour, marble, height. It's 103 feet from the floor to the top of the vault. No other church in England anywhere near as high. I mean, it was the most magnificent church in the kingdom. Personally, I think it was the most magnificent church in the world.
Why did he go to such lengths to spend so much money?
It's about 2 things. It's about piety, but it's also about power.
Henry III was determined to show that his Westminster wielded much greater power and influence than the city in the east, and that God and his authority ruled supreme.
Everybody sees this church when they come to London. It's here at the centre of everything, the centre of Parliament, the centre of the Exchequer, the law courts, everything functions here.
This is also where the crown shows off its supremacy. All English monarchs since 1066 have been crowned on this site, and there have been 16 royal weddings.
Westminster Abbey is the royal shopfront, and 800 years ago, when King Henry III rebuilt it, that was exactly what he set out to achieve.
It's now one of the most iconic buildings in the world, and a magnificent symbol of the rise of Westminster. But tucked away here in the cloisters, there's something else. A memorial that marks a critical moment in our capital's past, when it faced a catastrophe that would strike both the East and the West and kill half the population.
A disaster so terrible that it would completely change the country.
This is London's Millennium Bridge, a busy pedestrian crossing of the Thames joining Southwark back there with the City of London just up ahead. Now, every day, tens of thousands of people walk this route,
going about their daily business. But just imagine for a moment what it would look like if a deadly disease had ripped through the capital, killing tens of thousands and forcing the rest to flee. Today, a deserted London is almost unimaginable, but in the 14th century, it was a terrifying reality. In 1348, bubonic plague arrived in London, and it would change the face of the capital once again. In the space of 18 months, it killed half the city's population. Evidence of just how many Londoners died has been found in plague pits, excavated during projects like Crossrail. Some of those unfortunate victims are now in the vaults of the Museum of London, under the care of Jelena Beckverlag. Who's this?
Well, this lovely person is a male, and he was found in one of the mass burial trenches. The site was prepared, it was purchased by the government to cope with the number of people that were dying of the Black Death.
How many people were buried in the mass graves?
There were probably tens of thousands of individuals that would have been buried on that site.
Tens of thousands, wow. The Black Death of 1348 was one of the worst catastrophes in human history. It killed a third of the world's population. After the Black Death had ravaged London, how did the city change and how did life for Londoners change?
What we do know is that actually there was a positive outcome afterwards. Then people did appear to then be healthier. They had better access to good food, so they had better access to meat or fish or vegetables. Conditions for living may then also have been better because you didn't have quite so many people all living in a small space. So there's evidence that actually things may then have improved afterwards.
So if you survived the Black Death, then the chances were you or your children would grow up healthier, stronger, better nourished?
Yes, absolutely.
So despite all the horrors of this devastating pandemic, there were some positive benefits for Londoners. Black Death opened up opportunities for those who survived. So much so that just 30 years after plague had ripped through the city, London's streets were said to be paved with gold. There was about to be a new era of prosperity in the capital, and one man's fortune would transform both of London's great centres of power, the City and Westminster. His name was Dick Whittington. Just 30 years after the Black Death arrived in London and wiped out half of its population, the city experienced yet another dramatic transformation. There were now fewer people competing for positions of power, and business was booming. So opportunities opened up for enterprising folk to make their fortunes. One man is famous for doing just that, and he generously used his fortune to benefit the capital. His name was Richard Whittington, but he's better known to us as Dick Whittington. Now in pantomime, Whittington's the original poor boy done good, who came to London because he'd heard the streets were paved with gold and ended up making a fortune and becoming mayor, largely thanks to his amazing mouse-catching pet cat. I've always found that legend kind of strange because although Whittington did make a fortune and did become mayor, the journey he took to get there was very different from the one we think we know. No one really knows if Whittington had a cat at all, and he was far from being a street urchin when he arrived in the capital. Whittington was actually the youngest son of a knight from Gloucestershire. He came to London in the 1370s and got himself apprenticed in the mercer trade. That meant he was selling cloth, and lots of it. Whittington made a fortune, and he used his wealth to set up a sideline in money lending. And that would help to keep both sides of the capital happy. Then, as now, money was power, and Whittington had a lot of money. So it was no surprise in 1397, when his status as one of London's leading merchants, combined with his friendship with kings who bought his cloth and borrowed his cash, led to him being installed as London's mayor for the first of 4 terms. Whittington worked as mayor in the Guildhall, the centre of power in the east, in the old city of London. From here, he ran the city and used his fortune to make sure that it thrived.
Whittington understood that the most important thing that London's richest men could do was to keep the king of the day sweet. If the king was on side, he'd resist the urge to tax the merchants' trade or to interfere with the city's self-government.
These amazing old loan agreements from the 1400s show how Whittington did that, by lending money to the king.
Now at that time, his patron, the king who'd first appointed him as mayor, Richard II, had just been kicked off the throne. But what's Whittington already doing? Well, as this document shows, he's lending money to Richard's successor, Henry IV. And not only is he lending him money, it's actually secured, as it says here, on the crown jewels. Now, there's not a lot of loyalty on show here from Whittington, but what there is an enormous amount of political pragmatism.
As well as bailing out kings, Whittington used his wealth and influence to improve the capital itself, including paying for the redevelopment of this great hall in the heart of the city.
Every time I come into this room, I get goosebumps. This incredible space is the centrepiece of Guildhall, 15th century London's collective symbol of power, prestige and wealth. And it's the product of a redevelopment that was completed in the year 1411, at which point Whittington was about 60 years old. And unsurprisingly, he kicked into the redevelopment fund, and he also paid for a library here out of his own pocket.
But Whittington's generosity also extended to Londoners who were much less fortunate. He paid for public fountains to provide clean drinking water, redeveloped Newgate Prison, and supported the capital's hospitals. But that wasn't all.
Here on the Thames, by what's now Southwark Bridge, Whittington paid for a state-of-the-art public toilet. It could seat 128 on a long dock over the water, where the waste would be washed away twice a day by the tide.
By the 15th century, Whittington's London was still a tale of two separate cities, both competing for dominance. The powerful and wealthy old City of London centred around the Guildhall, and not to be outdone, the rapidly growing hub of Westminster, which was still competing to impose its royal influence on London.
About 2 miles along the Victoria embankment from Guildhall, there's a building that, when it was constructed, completely changed the face of London.
Westminster Hall. In 1393, Dick Whittington, ever the pragmatist, loaned money to the king so he could make this the most spectacular building in the capital.
Oh, wow. Look at this. This is enormous. I feel like an ant in a space like this.
This hall already existed in Westminster, but Whittington's loan paid for the installation of this enormous, unsupported roof.
I think more than anything, it's the height of this hall that's so impressive when you come in. It's absolutely stunning. And the space this affords you is incredible. It's 20 metres across and a good 70 metres long.
The aim was to create a masterpiece, more impressive than any rival building in the City of London.
Even after more than 600 years, Westminster Hall is still one of the largest public interiors in London, alongside some of the capital's grandest railway stations like Waterloo and King's Cross.
So it's not really surprising that ever since its construction, Westminster Hall has taken centre stage in the life of London.
These walls have witnessed some of the most famous events in London's history, and there are a few plaques along the floor here to commemorate them. It was in this cavernous space that William Wallace, aka Braveheart, and would-be terrorist Guy Fawkes were both sentenced to death.
It was also where King Charles I learnt that he was to lose his head.
And finally, this magnificent hall played a particularly important role in our story of the growth of the capital.
Back in the 16th century, Westminster Hall hosted the celebrations that ushered in the Tudors, a royal dynasty that gave us two of our most famous monarchs, Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. These two rulers would bring a new age of expansion to London, bringing the city and Westminster together, turning London into a single entity that would grow bigger, more crowded, and more powerful than ever before.
For centuries, London's two power centres, that's Westminster, where kings ruled supreme, and the City of London, where merchants controlled the nation's purse strings, were geographically quite distinct.
The two areas, the old city in the east and Westminster in the west, were also divided by the River Fleet. Today it's been paved over, but it once played a pivotal role in the story of London's growth.
Here at Ludgate Circus, I'm actually crossing right over the River Fleet, just as thousands of people do every day, most of them without even knowing they're doing it. But back in Tudor times, below me was a substantial body of water, which often flooded. And where we've just walked was a bridge connecting Westminster, a mile or so down there, with the City of London, just up ahead.
According to historian Dr. Matthew Green, the street that crossed the River Fleet became the most important in the capital.
So Matt, where are we right now?
So we're on Fleet Street, which is the world-famous home of the media industry.
And why was this street so important?
Well, if you think about it, we're standing in between the financial centre, the city, which evolved from the old Roman city. Further down there, we've got Westminster, which was the political hub. Fleet Street physically connected the two.
So I guess it's like an artery of power linking the two together.
Yeah, you had all sorts of courtiers and diplomats and merchants, important people whizzing back and forth down this street. And because of that, there became a lightning rod for news and gossip, the world's first information superhighway.
And it was along this vital artery, Fleet Street, that 16th century London began to expand. Buildings sprang up in the green fields between the two great centres, and over the following years, they would become one single entity. Over in Westminster, the king was about to embark on a brand new development that would astound and amaze. It was called Whitehall.
This was a king who threw out the rule book, and in so doing, transformed London. He was, of course, Henry VIII.
This domineering king had a single-minded ambition to create the largest palace in the known world. But he wouldn't stop there. His insatiable desire for money was about to change the face of London forever.
In 1529, Henry VIII had already been on the throne for 20 years. But his need to father a legitimate male heir, not to mention his wandering eye, meant that he would soon utterly transform the capital.
Henry's impact on London began in an area that is now called Whitehall in Westminster. Today it houses government offices. In the Tudor period, there was an enormous mansion here that belonged to the king's advisor, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey.
In Tudor London, Cardinal Wolsey was the second most influential man after the king. He was Lord Chancellor. He was head of the Catholic Church in England, and he built himself fantastic palaces, palaces practically fit for a king. That was his first mistake. Added to that, in 1529, Henry wanted to marry his mistress, Anne Boleyn, and Wolsey failed to get an annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. That was his second.
In retaliation, Henry had Wolsey charged with treason, and he seized the cardinal's desirable London residence for himself. He extended it massively, creating his Whitehall Palace. It was incredible. the largest palace in Europe and a new centre of power in the capital.
Tragically, Henry VIII's palace was gutted by fire in 1698, but not all of it was lost. I'm here at the offices of the Ministry of Defence at Whitehall, and I'm very lucky to get access. It's not every day that you can walk in here, but I've been given permission to see something I've never seen before.
This area is off limits to the public, and filming is carefully controlled for security reasons. But I'm going down below the MOD's rather characterless modern corridors to see what remains of Henry VIII's lost palace.
Oh, wow. This is incredible. This is a water chamber. It was Henry VIII's wine cellar from his Whitehall palace. So this is a palace that dominated this area of London, and this is all that survives of it. This is a place that Henry lived, he was married, he died. And we know that he used to come down to his wine cellars and sit down and gamble at cards with his men. Probably had a glass of wine as well too. And here I am in the space that he would have done that.
This small wine cellar is all that survives of a massive complex of buildings that radically increased the size of Westminster.
By the time it burnt down, Whitehall Palace contained more than 1,500 rooms and stretched over an area from Trafalgar Square down to Downing Street and out to the Thames. In fact, let me show you. This is a modern map of London, and we're here, and it stretched over this whole area here. So let me show you here. So we've got Trafalgar Square, all the way down to Downing Street, out to the Thames, although the Thames was a bit nearer then, and back again. So it covered some 23 acres of prime London real estate.
Henry had created an enormous private playground, but this was just the start. His insatiable greed would go on to utterly change the shape and character of London.
This is Hyde Park. It's one of the capital's most famous open green spaces, and it plays a key role in our story of Tudor London.
This sprawling 650-acre patch of prime London real estate changed hands nearly 500 years ago when Henry VIII seized it from the Catholic Church and turned it into a private hunting park. But that land grab was part of an event that started in the 1530s and radically changed the landscape of our nation and of our capital.
It began when Henry VIII cut England off from the Catholic Church. He then set his sights on taking over all their land.
In the City of London, the church owned more property than anyone else. As much as 60% of the land was held by Catholic monasteries.
Here at the London Metropolitan Archives, there's an etching that shows just how the capital's skyline was dominated by buildings owned by the church.
This is the Flemish artist Anthony van der Vingaard's panorama of London. It was originally created in 1550, and you really do get a sense of the whole of Tudor London stretching out as seen from the south bank of the Thames. Here's London Bridge, we've got St Paul's here, and dotted around really all over the city are monasteries, some of them in prime locations right by the riverfront.
From 1535 onwards, the church's massive London property portfolio was targeted by Henry VIII. In most cases, properties were simply handed over, but for the few who refused to conform to the king's will, there was bloodshed. Like here at Charterhouse in Smithfield.
The site covers about 13 acres, and in the early 1530s it had an annual income of around £640. Today that would be about £250,000. it also had a leader, Prior John Houghton, who strongly disapproved of Henry's sweeping religious changes. And that would be a bad combination.
On the 4th of May 1535, the king's trusted servants were sent to Charterhouse to insist that the prior and his monks acknowledge Henry as the head of the church. Historian Jenny Draper is an expert on what happened next.
Wow. Jenny, this is such a beautiful space, it's hard to imagine anyone not being happy with it. What was Henry VIII's problem with Charterhouse?
Well, the Charterhouse monks were really popular with the people, so when they didn't agree to his supremacy of the church, it was seen as a real threat to him.
And how did he react to that threat?
The prior, John Houghton, was hanged, drawn and quartered.
Which is not a nice way to go.
It's one of the worst ways you can go. He's taken to Tyburn. He is hanged until he's nearly dead. They cut him down before he asphyxiates. They cut him open here, and they take all his insides out. And then they cut him into quarters.
Right.
His arm was nailed to the door of the Charterhouse.
Now, if I was a monk at Charterhouse and I saw my boss's arm nailed up there, I'm sorry, I'm falling straight into line and I'm taking the oath, right?
Absolutely. Well, that's what I'd do. But it's not what they do. I mean, to them, it's not just a matter of life and death. It's a matter of their souls, their eternal souls. They cannot call Henry the head of the church. It goes completely against their convictions. So most of the monks in the Charterhouse refuse to take the oath, even after that. So they're also arrested. They're put in the tower. And they are starved to death.
Oh. So at that point is the end of Charterhouse as a monastery under Henry VIII?
Yeah, Henry VIII takes hold of the land and the buildings. He uses it as a storage space, essentially. He doesn't ever live here, he just leaves his stuff here.
Wow. So at the end of all this process, Henry's got rid of all the monks who wouldn't do what he said, and he's got Charterhouse. It's kind of a win-win.
For him, yeah.
For him.
Henry's brutal seizure of Charterhouse was the beginning of a land grab that would turn him into the capital's richest property tycoon. He bagged himself hundreds of acres of London, which he then rented out or sold on to the gentry and nobility for a massive profit.
This was a cataclysmic, traumatic time that changed the whole belief system and the landscape of the country. And London, with its unusually high concentration of religious houses, was utterly transformed.
But this ill-fated monastery still had another role to play in the checkered history of London.
In 1558, Elizabeth I, a new Tudor monarch, stayed for a week as a guest here. In fact, she prepared for her coronation in this very chamber. And it was during her reign that London would begin the next stage on its journey to become the capital not just of a nation, but of an empire.
And it was the swashbuckling exploits of Elizabethan adventurers who would lead the way.
In the story of London, Henry VIII's land grab in the 1530s made him a super-rich property tycoon and redrew the map of the city. By the time his daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, took the throne, London was also a thriving port, taking full advantage of its position on the Thames.
Elizabeth was crowned in London in January 1559, and the city that turned out to cheer her was already a trading powerhouse. Every necessity, every luxury that you could think of was coming in and out of London. Wool, wine, timber, pitch, tar, soap, you name it. London was booming, but it was also growing, and fast.
To cope with the increase in trade, the city's docks were expanding, spreading the boundaries of London east along the banks of the river, making the Thames very different from the one we recognise today.
The Elizabethan River Thames was lined with quays and warehouses right along the north bank, from the Tower to London Bridge and beyond. And at riverside hamlets such as Shadwell, Limehouse and Rotherhithe, ships were simply pulled up onto mud berths to be unloaded. London's docklands had really taken off, and where I am now was one of the busiest quays.
But the docks were about to get even busier. London was becoming a global city as the exploits of plucky Elizabethan adventurers like Sir Francis Drake helped to establish the port as a major hub in a network of international trade routes.
In 1581, Deptford became the focus point for the celebration of one of the most famous moments in maritime history, the return of the Golden Hind. 4 years after it had left London, this remarkably unsophisticated vessel had become the first English ship to successfully circumnavigate the globe, and in doing so, turned its captain, Francis Drake, into an A-list celebrity.
Today, you can explore an exact replica of Drake's ship, just as Londoners did on the original vessel 500 years ago.
In 1581, they all came to see the ship that had achieved this magnificent feat of navigation. But more importantly, they wanted to associate themselves with the man who'd brought to London a staggering fortune of plundered gems and gold.
Nowadays, we'd probably call Drake a pirate. Back then, Londoners hailed him as a hero.
During his circumnavigation, Drake seized the Spanish treasure ship making its way back from the Caribbean and liberated it of an incredible hoard consisting of a dozen chests of coins, 26 tons of silver and 40 kilograms of gold. And that was just one of several ships he'd plundered on his voyage.
When the Golden Hind finally arrived back in London, it was enthusiastically met by the nation and a very grateful Queen.
That's because Drake donated half of his looted fortune to Elizabeth. The exact sum of her share is unknown. The Queen made sure it was a state secret, but it's thought to have been enough to pay off the national debt at a single stroke. It's no wonder then that on the 4th of April 1581, Queen Elizabeth had Drake knighted on the deck of the ship that had transformed the fortunes of the crown.
The adventures of the Elizabethan sea dogs like Drake put London on course to become a centre for world trade. But the Queen wanted much more for her capital and country. Here in the Queen's House in Greenwich, there's a portrait that gives us clues to her ambitious intentions.
I love this picture of Elizabeth I. It's such a picture of power and riches. You see the message of her as a virgin queen draped with pearls. You've got the victory over the Spanish Armada. But there's also one other thing about this picture that I love, a detail that people often miss. Look where she's got her hand. It's not on her own country, it's on the Americas. Because by the time this painting was completed, Drake had not only sailed around the entire world, he'd inspired his queen and his fellow Englishmen to dream of dominating a brave new world.
London's maritime might would take control of trade routes that stretched from the Americas via the Caribbean to Southeast Asia, importing tobacco, spices and potatoes. And when the East India Trading Company was established in London, it would become the most powerful corporation in history, arguably bigger than Amazon, Apple and Google combined. As London's commercial power grew and the money flooded in, so did people from all over the world, cashing in on the new prosperity.
London's population grew from around 60,000 in 1530 to nearly 500,000 in 1665. But London's success would come at a heavy price.
At the end of the Tudor period, London was famous across the world as a centre for international trade. It had become a magnet for migrants from Europe and all over England, all of them seeking employment and wealth.
In the 13th century, when we began this chapter of the story, London was simply 2 settlements on the Thames, with a population of just 80,000 people. But 3 centuries later, despite the ravages of the plague, that population had exploded by a factor of 6, and close to 500,000 people now called it home. The result was a significant change in the appearance of the city.
And this is what it looked like. London, as this engraving originally from the time shows us, was still divided into distinct areas of population. So here, north of the Thames, distinguished by all of these spires and the buildings higgledy-piggledy on top of one another, is the city, bounded by the walls. It's what we still call the City of London. Here, on the other side of the river, spreading out from the southern end of London Bridge, where we can see all these traitors' heads rather gruesomely impaled on spikes. Well, this is Southwark. And over here to the west, beyond the limits of this engraving, is Westminster. And that too had expanded, developed and grown.
London was still very much a low-rise city, but it was now crammed full of buildings. And its cramped housing and dense population would turn out to be a lethal combination. In 1665, a massive disaster hit the city, and it arrived on the River Thames.
London's wealth, its booming trade, and its political influence all came ultimately from the wharves and docks that lined this stretch of river. But that same river that had done so much to make the city rich would in 1665 usher in the first disaster that transformed London.
Because as well as valuable goods, the ships arriving here from the continent brought a deadly disease.
The bubonic plague had first come to London with the Black Death of 1348, which killed as much as half the population in the space of a single year. But over the next 300 years, plague returned to Britain 40 times. Sometimes the outbreaks were mild, sometimes they claimed hundreds or even thousands of lives. And in the 1660s, plague returned to the capital with a vengeance.
It started in December 1664, just outside London, when the first plague death was recorded.
These are bills of mortality. They're official government records of the deaths that occurred in London in the year 1664 and 1665. And what they tell us about the spread of plague is something quite extraordinary. This is the first of them. It covers the period of Christmas time, 1664. And it's a list of the usual things that people were dying of in the 17th century. So we've got 15 deaths of dropsy, 7 deaths of rickets, 1 death from wind, which I think must be a pretty horrible way to go. 1 person died from the plague, and that occurred in St Giles in the Fields. Then we move on to the summer. Well, now plague deaths have rocketed. There are 470 recorded in a single week, and deaths from consumption and deaths from fever have both gone up. A month later, 2,010 people died of plague, and by the time we get to the end of August, 6,988 people have died of plague in a single week. This is an epidemic of apocalyptic proportions.
As the Great Plague raged throughout the summer, those who could afford to leave the city fled, but hundreds of thousands stayed and died.
One of our best guides to London at the time of the plague is the diarist Samuel Pepys. Now, we know he stayed in the city during the plague because in his diary he kept a grisly log of the numbers of people who died. He writes that up to 6,000 people died every week, and all you could hear day and night was bells tolling for the dead. Now, by 1666, the population of London had fallen by between 1/4 and 1/3, but there was much, much worse to come.
In the 1660s, London streets were lined with Elizabethan townhouses, like these distinctive black and white half-timbered style buildings.
You've got leaded windows, those diagonal and horizontal wooden beams, and that characteristic overhanging first floor. But these are timber-framed buildings with open fireplaces, and in an age before modern building regs and health and safety, that was going to prove a deadly recipe.
So far on our 1600-year journey, we've seen a small settlement on the banks of the Thames grow to become the capital of England. We've witnessed how the old city and Westminster came together to create one centre of power.
And in the next chapter of our story, we'll reveal how London's cramped housing and timber buildings would cause the almost total devastation of the city. The Great Fire would leave only 20% of the city standing. But miraculously, a grand new London would emerge from the ashes.
This is London, one of the largest and most successful cities on Earth.
Wow. Its story spans 2,000 years of daring invasions, catastrophic fire, heroic ambition, and astonishing technological transformations. From the Romans to the Tudors, from the Vikings to the Victorians.
For years, this was the capital of the world, ruling over an empire of billions. So how did London rise up from an uninhabitable marshland to become the thriving 21st century city we see today?
In this series, we'll reveal the crucial events that changed the very shape and size of London.
I'll be digging down into the latest research to uncover conflict, betrayal, and power politics.
I'll be getting special access to some of the city's most extraordinary sites.
And I'll be exploring the innovation and engineering brilliance that gave rise to London's most famous landmarks.
So join us as we go on an amazing journey.
Absolutely brilliant.
To discover exactly how this incredible city was created. So far on our journey, we've seen a small settlement on the banks of the River Thames grow to become the capital of England, boasting some of the grandest buildings in Europe.
I feel like an ant in a space like this.
We've witnessed how the greed of Henry VIII changed the face of the city and tracked the devastating plague that wiped out a quarter of the population.
In this chapter, we pick up the story of London in 1666, when the capital faced a new disaster that threatened to wipe it from the map. By the mid-17th century, London's population had reached 350,000. The city spread some 5 miles from east to west, and it was thriving. But in September 1666, London experienced one of the biggest catastrophes in all of its history. And it started right here in the heart of the city.
This is Pudding Lane, a street that earned its name from the puddings, or offal sausages, that butchers used to produce here. But today it's most famously associated with the Great Fire of London, a blaze that started as a simple yard fire and ended up nearly razing the entire city to the ground.
But recent research into documents from the time has revealed that the actual start of the Great Fire was just around the corner from Pudding Lane, here on Monument Street. This was the back of a bakehouse belonging to a man called Thomas Fariner.
It seems almost incredible that a small fire in the backyard of a baker's shop could do such damage that it threatened the survival of a great capital. But that is precisely what happened here on the night of the 1st to 2nd of September 1666. A hot summer had baked the city dry, and strong east winds whistled through the streets, ideal for spreading flames from one timber frame building to the next. Add to that the fire started at a time when it could do maximum damage, in the early hours of a Sunday morning when most people were blissfully asleep. The fire had time to take hold, and the results were catastrophic.
The fire spread rapidly outwards from Fariner's bakery, fanned by the winds. It tore through warehouses on the riverfront, storing pitch, tar, hemp and other flammable goods. It laid waste to homes and shops, and it sent people scattering into the streets, trying to save themselves and their possessions.
Panic among the city's leaders and inadequate firefighting methods meant that by the time the wind dropped and the fire had been brought under control, almost all of old London, the Tudor houses, the Norman buildings, the Saxon churches had been destroyed. In 5 days, the fire had consumed over 13,000 houses, 87 churches, most of the buildings of the city's authorities, and famously, St. Paul's Cathedral.
I'm scaling the memorial to the Great Fire, the monument, to relive the experience of the famous diarist Samuel Pepys.
On the 5th, just as the fire was starting to die out, Samuel Pepys climbed the tower of All Hallows Church in Barking, just over there, to see for himself the devastation the fire had wrought to his beloved London. He later wrote about it in his diary, saying it was the saddest sight of desolation I ever saw. I became afeard to stay there long, therefore down again as fast as I could, the fire being spread as far as I could see. Nearly 80% of the City of London down there had been reduced to ashes.
The survivors could only look around their ruined city and despair. 100,000 Londoners were homeless. The Great Fire was one of the most disastrous episodes in London's past, and many thought it would never recover. But it had taken some 1,600 years to build this city, and it was not about to be snuffed out. One man saw the almost total devastation as an opportunity to build a grand new capital.
Ask a Londoner and they'll most likely know the architect of this great cathedral, St. Paul's, was of course Sir Christopher Wren. But what they may not know is that this London landmark with its splendid dome was one part of a much more ambitious, grand plan. And if Wren had had his way, London would look radically different.
A week after the Great Fire had almost razed the city to the ground, King Charles II invited ideas for a new London, and Wren responded. Historian Leo Hollis has studied Wren's plans for a new kind of London.
Wren imagined a modern city that would compete with Paris or Rome. Exquisite to look at, elegant, ordered, measured. One can sort of see a brand new grid system. There are these squares, these piazzas. He was thinking about the grand public spaces where people would meet.
Although Wren's plan was considered, it wasn't approved. But there was one significant feature that was, eventually, given the go-ahead. A magnificent new St. Paul's Cathedral. To get it commissioned, he first had to build an elaborate model that's now locked away in one of the cathedral's hidden rooms.
I mean, it is like a Wendy house for a very, very spoilt child, isn't it?
Wren's first two designs had been rejected outright, so he was hoping this model would persuade King Charles, the church bishops, and city officials to give his third design the go-ahead.
Wren was convinced that this was the one, so he and Charles thought that building the model would be the thing that would persuade all the other partners within the deal.
And did it work?
No, it was a disaster. Again, the bishops hated it. And it was said that Wren went home and wept that night.
But Wren did create one more design, and that finally got the approval of all the important clients.
What happened after that was extraordinary, which is Charles whispered into Wren's ear, you can make any alterations that you like, you don't have to come back, just start building. And almost instantly, Wren started to rethink the whole cathedral.
In the end, it took 35 years to complete, and the most ambitious part of the whole cathedral was its famous dome. Even today, it dominates the skyline.
But imagine if Wren's scheme had been accepted and London had been rebuilt according to his plan. Instead, it retains its irregular, rather chaotic, but I like to think rather charming streets. And within a few years, it was back up and running.
And it would grow bigger and richer than ever before. But it would also become a city divided. While the super rich turned London into their playground, it was a very different story for the poor.
Within just 10 years of the Great Fire of 1666, large areas of London had been rebuilt, giving the city a grand new facelift. But in those run-down areas that escaped the fire, whole streets became ghettos for the poor.
Here in St Giles, on the eastern side of Soho, houses were divided up, and in some, between 50 and 90 people could lodge for the night.
The alleyways in the ghetto decayed into a squalid, overcrowded slum, known as a rookery, after the nesting habits of rooks that roost close together in large, noisy groups.
With all this came sights and smells that offended the rich men and women of the city. They in turn began to look elsewhere to build their homes.
Just like today, the wind usually blew to the east, taking London's dirty air with it. So the rich looked to the west, with its sweeping green landscapes and sweet, fresh air. In 1700, the land between Regent Street and Hyde Park, that we know today as Mayfair, was still open fields. And it was owned by the powerful Grosvenor family. In 1720, they set about developing a grand residential estate. I'm meeting Professor Elaine Challis at the London Library to look at the original plans.
And it's amazing to see the fields in the background there. You know, you really have a sense that it's just on the edge of London.
Absolutely, yeah. London is just gradually moving out, and so you've got areas which are still very rural. People with cattle and grazing and crops.
The Grosvenors began to build palatial London homes for themselves and other wealthy families. And the jewel in the crown of their desirable new estate was Grosvenor Square, just south of present-day Oxford Street.
It was very fashionable. Grosvenor Square was the biggest, the best, the most advertised, and the most expensive. This is aristocratic heaven.
The Grosvenor estate and other wealthy developments nearby pushed the western edge of the capital out by over half a mile. It laid the foundations for Mayfair and eventually London's famous West End. Once the capital's rich and titled had moved in, they set about turning this stylish new area in the west into their playground. And I'm meeting writer and historian Joseph Friedman to find out how these wealthy Londoners lived.
Tell me a bit more about this lifestyle, this excessive, decadent lifestyle.
There were parties morning, noon and night. It might begin with a levee, attended perhaps by 100 people in the morning. Lunch parties, card parties, musical parties, balls, assemblies, and this would go on all night. Some parties only began around midnight.
Why did they spend so much time in London? Why did they invest in it in such a way?
London in the 18th century was perhaps a more important capital city than that of any other nation-state in Europe. London was the centre of political life, commercial life, cultural life, social life, etc., in a way that other foreign capitals were not.
As the capital's wealthy were living it up in the rapidly expanding west side of the city, the situation for the poor in the east was getting worse. Here, people lived in crowded slum housing and workhouses, and life was so hard that many were forced to beg for food. But there was something they could afford that made life's hardships easier to bear: gin.
Gin had been distilled in London for several decades, but increasing poverty and harsh living conditions meant that people were turning to the bottle rather than more expensive drinks like beer. In 1735, Londoners consumed more than 6 million gallons of gin. That's half a pint per adult per day.
Anyone could distill and sell it, and there were over 7,000 gin shops trading in London. Taverns advertised drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2 pennies.
Cheers.
Cheers.
One man who knows about the effects of gin on the poor of the East End is Olivier Ward.
I'm guessing the stuff that we've got here isn't quite the same sort of stuff that they were drinking in the early 18th century.
I couldn't be further from it. Theirs would have been badly distilled and often filled with oil of vitriol, like turpentine, sulfuric acid, and methylated spirits in there.
By 1750, gin consumption was at its height, with Londoners swilling back 11 million gallons a year. In the poorer areas of London, it seemed that everyone was permanently drunk.
In the East End, almost 1 in 4 houses would have been making gin in one way or another.
So gin is the sort of crack of 18th century London?
Absolutely, and an epidemic that would be akin to a crack epidemic today. It really was as bad as that.
This level of drunkenness led to a complete breakdown in the quality of life.
What was the effect on London as a city?
The craze just ripped apart society and just completely deconstructed the very fabric of it. It pitted people against others, neighbours, friends, because it relied on informants to tell the government and the police who was making these backyard gins.
We hear these phrases dating from the gin craze like mother's ruin, which kind of imply that women were drinking a lot of gin. I mean, is that actually the case?
Well, I mean, everyone was drinking gin. It was man, woman and child, so it wasn't just women. But yes, there is a case, Judith Darfour, who actually took her child into a heath, murdered it to sell its petticoats to buy gin, and then returning to work later on that day as if nothing had happened.
Gin-related crime soared, and mother's ruin was blamed for the deaths of thousands of men, women and children. When the death rate climbed higher than the birth rate, the government was forced to act. So they outlawed small gin distilleries. And eventually, the period known as the gin craze came to an end.
Meanwhile, in the west of the city, it was a very different story. The rich had immense amounts of money to spend, and their wealth would transform the West End into one of the best-known shopping districts in the world.
Instead of spending their wealth behind closed doors, having tradesmen deliver textiles, shoes and hats to their houses, the rich now wanted to be seen out and about, perambulating the stylish streets. And so the West End shopping experience was born.
In the 18th century, London's West End grew bigger than Mayfair and spread to include Marylebone and Fitzrovia. It would eventually see the creation of famous shopping streets like Piccadilly, Regent Street and Bond Street.
The city became a world-renowned shopper's paradise. Visitors came to London specifically for the shopping experience and were amazed by the range of goods on offer.
By the 1700s, people could buy whatever they wanted in London because the city was at the centre of an explosion in international trade. And that was down to one thing: the River Thames. The Thames has always played a critical role in the prosperity of London, and by the end of the 18th century, the sheer volume of goods coming into London via its river was astonishing.
Ships coming here were supplying Londoners with all their luxury and exotic goods. Goods like chocolate, sugar, rum, pepper, teas and silks. And the population here just couldn't get enough of it. And the River Thames was struggling to cope.
The entire width of the river was crammed with ships, more than 1,500 in an area meant for just 545. It was said that you could walk from one side to the other without getting your feet wet.
This chaotic situation meant that ships were often stuck in the Thames for weeks and were regularly damaged. But by far the biggest problem was thieves. By the end of the century, it's estimated some 37,000 workers were employed on or around the Thames, and about a third of them were thought to be professional criminals. Now, these thieves had various names according to their particular brand of theft. You had river pirates, night plunderers, light horsemen, heavy horsemen, scuffle hunters and mudlarks. They were all bad for business, and something had to change.
A committee of powerful businessmen came up with the solution. In 1799, they built the city's first secure, enclosed docks here on the Isle of Dogs.
The West India Dock was one of the most ambitious public building projects ever before attempted in England. Where I am here now was the import dock, where ships would sail in and offload their goods before heading round to the export dock to be loaded up and head back out down the Thames. This was a completely new way of operating.
Until now, ships had been forced to moor in the river near London Bridge and wait for smaller boats to shuttle their goods upstream. The new docks would be far more efficient.
For the first time, cargo could be offloaded and stored right here at the docks. Now, these two buildings here, now the Museum of London Docklands, give you some idea of what the site would have been like. There were actually 9 of these warehouses, and in total, they could store the entire annual import of sugar and have enough room over for vast quantities of rum. But most importantly, it was completely safe because the docks were surrounded by a 30-foot high security wall.
The West India Docks and others like them would ease congestion on the Thames and ensure that London remained the world's busiest port. This upgrade to the river came in the nick of time, as London was about to be catapulted into the industrial age. Rapid growth and a population explosion would push the city to its limits. The 19th century would be London's toughest challenge yet. On the 28th of June 1838, Londoners watched in awe as an 18-year-old princess was crowned. Queen Victoria would reign over an era of extraordinary progress and prosperity, and her capital would grow into the world's most powerful city. London was also becoming industrialised faster than any other city in the world. And in the 19th century, it entered the age of the factory.
The Industrial Revolution was taking place, and the capital was being transformed by new technology.
But for some, there was a price to pay. As factories sprang up right across the east of the city, conditions for those who lived here became unbearable.
In the 1830s, this part of southeast London was known as Jacob's Island, a densely built-up commercial area of factories, tanneries, warehouses and mills, with rickety old houses built in between them, all surrounded by a man-made ditch.
All these new industries created pollution, and the main waterway, once the area's lifeblood, turned into a deadly creek known as Folly Ditch.
To give you some idea of what it was like to live here, Charles Dickens gave a vivid description in his bestseller, Oliver Twist. He wrote, "Dirt besmeared walls and decaying foundations, every loathsome indication of filth, rot and garbage." Dickens subsequently killed off his villain, Bill Sikes, in the mud of Folly Ditch.
The mix of terrible sanitary conditions and industrial pollution was typical in East London, and fumes from heavy industry and coal fires covered the streets in a dangerous smog.
Those toxic conditions had a dreadful effect on the health of the population, and we know that because it's written into their bones.
At the Museum of London, bone expert Jelena Bekvalak is showing me the skeleton of a woman who lived through the Industrial Revolution in London.
You could see changes in her lower legs, so in the tibiae, the shins, you can see they're very curved and bowed.
They're almost like boomerangs, aren't they?
Yes.
So tell me what's caused that.
She had rickets when she was younger, so the vitamin D deficiency.
That's caused by a lack of sunlight.
Yes, and we begin to see an increase in these diseases of rickets and scurvy when it's becoming more urban and more industrial. You've got closer living quarters, more people crammed into smaller spaces, it's darker, the potential for all the different types of pollutants.
I mean, these diseases that children were developing, I mean, it's horrible to look at.
It is. I mean, there were a lot of pressures and stresses that were being placed on people by the nature of the changes that were going on into London.
It's actually pretty sobering looking at those skeletons and thinking about the terrible impact of industrialisation on the people who lived through those dramatic years of change. All of those lives sacrificed in making London the greatest city in the world.
As the century progressed, the pace of change showed no signs of slowing down. In fact, the capital was about to undergo another transformation. This time it was thanks to a new creation, the greatest invention of the Victorian age, the railways. And they would change the capital beyond all recognition. The first railway station in London was London Bridge, built in 1836, and that was just the beginning of railway mania.
This is a snapshot of London near the start of this boom in the construction of the railways, and you can see on it the first major routes into the capital. You've got Euston Station up here, which was the terminus for the first long-distance line into London, coming down from Birmingham. And you've got this line up here, the London and Greenwich Railway, which terminates at London Bridge. And then from the east, follow this line in to Fenchurch Street, which was the first railway station to be built within the City of London.
This was a period of intense railway investment, driven by fiercely competitive private rail companies. By 1846, there were no less than 19 of them, with plans to build stations right in the middle of London.
19! I mean, it was bordering on the ridiculous. Just imagine what that would have done to the city. Thankfully, the government stepped in and decided to set up a royal commission to consider how to prevent London being destroyed by the railways.
The commission came up with a rail exclusion zone. This meant that railway lines were not allowed to go all the way into the centre, but had to stop at its boundary. And this is where railway companies built their stations, each one trying to outdo the others with ever more spectacular architecture.
The terminus here at London Paddington was built in 1854 by one of the most celebrated civil engineers in history, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. As chief engineer of the Great Western Railway, he was thrilled when he won the contract to design this station. And just look what he came up with.
This was his masterpiece, designed to outdo the Great Northern Railway's terminus at Euston, 2 miles to the east.
Brunel didn't hold back. At the time it was built, this was the largest train shed roof in the world. Even today, Paddington Station stands out as a spectacular piece of architecture.
Brunel's grand station was soon followed by Victoria, Charing Cross, and in 1866, St Pancras. The railways changed the shape of London perhaps more than any other invention in its history. The capital began to expand rapidly outwards into the surrounding countryside, and thousands more people living in rural areas were now able to commute in. But there was one area of London cut off from the prosperity of the city. Northern villages like Highgate and Hampstead were built on hills far too steep to build a railway on.
So the Victorian engineers came up with a plan to connect this area to the railway network. and I'm on my way now to see one of the best preserved abandoned Victorian railway stations in London to see what they came up with.
Highgate was one of the first northern hillside villages to be joined to the city. Today, its old railway station is kept under lock and key.
There we go.
Lovely, thank you, Chris. Super.
But Chris Nix from the London Transport Museum is giving me special access.
That lovely cottage over there was part of the first station here.
When construction began in the 1860s, they cut a deep valley out of Highgate Hill and built the station in the dip.
You do feel that you are in a bit of a cut-out bowl in here almost.
You are. There was a natural dip in the land here originally, and that was extended down to create this cutting. Mind the nettles and the brambles.
It is completely overgrown here now.
It is.
So the trains could reach the platforms, the Victorians used pioneering technology to blast tunnels through the hillside at each end of the station.
Let's just do the magic and unlock. And,
keys, more secret access.
This door normally doesn't get unlocked because of the bats that are inside it.
Fantastic. There is light at the end of the tunnel.
You see the remains of the tracks there.
Now this tunnel, the one just next to it, and the pair at the far end of the station penetrate right through the hillside here.
Thanks to new tunnels like these, the capital could be connected to previously remote areas like Highgate. It meant London's boundaries could expand and more people could get into the centre of the city.
This was part of a new concept of not having to work where you live. Arguably, this was the beginning of the age of the commuter.
In the mid-19th century, an estimated 27,000 passengers were travelling into London every day. At the same time, the population of the city was exploding. At the beginning of the century, it had stood at 1 million, but by the 1850s, that number had trebled to a staggering 3 million.
This rapid growth created serious problems because the capital was depending on a dangerously primitive water supply.
Because homes and businesses didn't have modern toilets or running water, people had to draw all the water they needed for cooking, drinking and washing from communal wells or pumps. Their sewage was dumped directly into the Thames or into open pits called cesspools. These were perfect conditions for disease to spread.
One of the most deadly diseases to hit the capital at this time was cholera. It had made its first grisly appearance in London in the 1830s, killing around 6,000 Londoners. By the 1850s, the death toll was much worse.
In these Soho streets, there were more than 500 deadly attacks of cholera in just 10 days.
Something had to be done to stop the relentless spread of the disease. I'm meeting author and historian Amanda Thomas to find out how local resident Dr. John Snow stepped in to help.
He very quickly realised from his past experience that it was likely that their drinking habits and their dietary habits were linked to their health.
But people didn't believe him.
No, absolutely not, because the general consensus of the time was that it was spread by miasma, by bad smells, and when you came to London in those days, the smells were abominable. So you can perfectly understand why people would think that disease would spread through bad smells.
John Snow was convinced that people were being made ill by drinking contaminated water from a pump in Broad Street, but he had to prove it. And he did that by mapping the victims.
So this is the map that John Snow used to work out how the cholera was spreading, right?
This was the map that he produced, which was a stroke of genius, because each line represents a death. He added these extra lines to show how many people had died in each property, to prove that it was the water from the pump that was causing the deaths.
And I can see the pump is marked here, then that would have been over
just
there.
over there, exactly outside the pub. And at the factory over there, where the high concentration of deaths were, they were specifically keeping water from the pump to use to drink.
But actually, there are some patches here, like there's a little sort of bald spot here. Why was that?
Yeah, that was the workhouse. And you would have thought, wouldn't you, that they were the worst affected. There were over 500 inmates, but only 5 died. He knew they had their own deep well. They weren't taking water from the pump.
Snow took his research to the city officials and asked them to take the handle off the pump, making it impossible to draw water. They were reluctant to believe him, but they agreed to remove the handle as a trial. And not long afterwards, the outbreak of cholera stopped.
It was proof that the water from the pump was the cause of the cholera outbreak. But the Victorian establishment was not for turning.
They were so set on their miasma theory that even with the evidence staring them in the face, they rejected Snow's arguments. The whole city continued to dump their waste into the Thames and into cesspools, and so they continued to contaminate their own water supply. It would take more than the lives of the poor to spur them into action.
By the mid-19th century, as more and more people flocked to the city, London's infrastructure was struggling to cope. It would take the genius of one remarkable man to save the city from squalor.
By the mid-19th century, London was the most powerful capital in the world, but it was growing far too fast with a sewage system that was dangerously outdated. The tipping point came in the summer of 1858, when the city was hit by an oppressive heat wave. On June the 16th, the temperature reached 35 degrees Celsius, a record for the time, and Londoners could take no more.
The stench of the Thames had become unbearable. The novelist Charles Dickens wrote, "Through the heart of the town, a deadly sewer ebbed and flowed." Centuries of slaughterhouse and industrial waste, plus human excrement, stewed in the heat of the river and baked on its banks. The Thames was now the most contaminated, the most unhygienic, the filthiest river in the world.
At first, government ministers were resistant to any kind of reform because they knew it would involve a major overhaul of the entire infrastructure.
But eventually the stink became overpowering. MPs were seen running from the chamber, holding handkerchiefs to their noses, complaining loudly. They even tried soaking the parliamentary curtains in lime chloride to mask the smell. Finally, the Great Stink, as it became known, forced the hand of Parliament and pushed through reforms that should have happened centuries before.
On August the 2nd, the government passed an act instructing the Metropolitan Board of Works to produce a plan to carry London's rotting waste far away outside the city.
The board's chief engineer was the brilliant Joseph Bazalgette, and he set about designing what was at the time the largest civil engineering project in the world. His plan was to channel all the city's waste far enough east so that when it discharged into the Thames, it would be swept out to sea on the tide.
I'm meeting civil engineer Gordon Masterton, who's been studying Bazalgette's original plans for a sewer system.
How much sewerage needed to be built?
Yeah, well, Bazalgette's scheme had a total of 1,300 miles of sewers to be reconstructed in London.
1,300 miles?
Absolutely. And on top of that, the large interceptor sewers added together amount to 82 miles of quite substantial diameter sewers underneath the streets of London.
To move the wastewater and excrement eastwards, Bazalgette's sewers made use of London's hilly terrain.
The natural and easy solution is to go from the high ground to the low ground by gravity, where the gradients don't allow introducing pumping stations to lift the sewage vertically.
All of that then flowed out along this final section here, and that's the entry point there into the Thames before being taken out to sea.
The pipes to take all the effluent from London's population had to be huge, but Bazalgette doubled their size. If he'd not done that, It's estimated our sewers would have overflowed sometime in the 1960s. Bazalgette also came up with an ingenious plan to install them underneath the city.
To avoid digging up vast swathes of London and causing mayhem on the streets, Bazalgette created huge embankments along the Thames to contain the massive main sewage pipes. This wall of Somerset House once stood in the Thames. But look at it now, it's dry as a bone. That's because between 1864 and 1870, Bazalgette reclaimed all of the land between here and the river over there, and in doing so, created the Victoria embankment.
Together, the Victoria, Albert, and Chelsea embankments provided London with 52 acres of extra land where it was most congested. And in the middle of the embankment gardens, there's a fascinating remnant from the past that shows how the river once flowed through here.
This image shows York House, a mansion that once stood on the banks of the Thames, with these steps leading right down to the water. Today, York Water Gate is all that's left. This gate perched just as it was before, on top of the steps, but with no real function. It's just left here, isolated in the middle of these gardens.
Bazalgette is famous for sorting London's sewer problem, but he was also responsible for some much more attractive features of the city.
As part of his job as an engineer, he was asked to inspect 12 of London's bridges, and he found that some of them were in a terrible state.
Hammersmith Bridge was crumbling under the weight of London's increasing traffic. So in 1884, Bazalgette oversaw its reconstruction.
When Bazalgette made his replacements, he included all the ornate, decorative cast iron. And it is just stunning.
2 miles downriver at Putney, he completely replaced the old bridge and built a new one out of granite. Today, it's one of London's busiest road bridges. Further east, Bazalgette designed the new Battersea Bridge.
The bridge that Bazalgette replaced here connected the poorer district of Battersea on the south side of the river with the riches of Chelsea on the north.
Even further east, Bazalgette found another bridge in a perilous state. Albert Bridge was so unstable, it was known as the Trembling Lady, and a sign still hangs at its northern end, asking troops from nearby Chelsea barracks to march out of step, because the vibrations from their footsteps strained the weakened bridge. So Bazalgette strengthened Albert Bridge with steel chains, ensuring it survived until today. Few Londoners have ever made such a lasting impression on their city.
This is a monument to Bazalgette, and it's far too modest in my opinion, because his remarkable sewer system not only cleaned up the city, he transformed this area of the capital, gave us all those wonderful bridges, and in my view, helped make London one of the most beautiful cities on the planet.
In the final chapter of London's extraordinary story, we'll see how the capital grows to become a mega-city, unrivaled in power and influence.
It wasn't just the capital of Britain, it was the capital of the British Empire and of the British Commonwealth of Nations.
How it endures 2 of the world's most terrible wars. And how it's transformed once again by Crossrail, one of the boldest engineering projects in London's entire history.
This is London, one of the largest and most successful cities on Earth.
Wow. Its story spans 2,000 years of daring invasions, catastrophic fire, heroic ambition, and astonishing technological transformations. From the Romans to the Tudors, from the Vikings to the Victorians.
For years, this was the capital of the world, ruling over an empire of billions. So how did London rise up from an uninhabitable marshland to become the thriving 21st century city we see today?
In this series, we'll reveal the crucial events that changed the very shape and size of London.
I'll be digging down into the latest research to uncover conflict, betrayal, and power politics.
I'll be getting special access to some of the city's most extraordinary sites.
And I'll be exploring the innovation and engineering brilliance that gave rise to London's most famous landmarks.
So join us as we go on an amazing journey.
Absolutely brilliant.
To discover exactly how this incredible city was created.
So far on our journey to map the capital's 2,000-year history, we've seen it grow from a swampy marshland to a great Roman city, from a divided centre of power to a congested capital that was struggling to cope.
The stench of the Thames had become unbearable.
In this final chapter, we arrive at the mid-Victorian era and will reveal how London grew to become a colossal city, unrivaled in power and influence.
How it endured two of the world's most terrible wars.
And how one of the boldest engineering projects in London's history, Crossrail, will propel the city into the future.
In 1801, there were just over 1 million people living in London. Yet, within a single generation, that number had tripled to just over 3 million. And that is an extraordinary statistic. Just imagine if the population of London today tripled in just 60 years.
This is Victorian London. It's set to become the greatest and largest city on Earth. By the middle of the 19th century, with the arrival of railways, roads and sanitation, the capital had transformed beyond recognition. Mid-Victorian London was a force to be reckoned with. By 1860, its boundaries had extended to the open fields of Middlesex in the north and Surrey in the south. This rich and prosperous capital drew people here in their millions, and as a result, it was bursting at the seams.
Just like today, London's roads would have been packed full of commuters. But believe it or not, in the 1860s, the congestion was a lot worse than today.
In 1860, 13.5 million people travelled by train to London Bridge Station alone. But major stations like this had been built on the outskirts of the city.
So the only way all those people could get to their offices, stores and workshops in central London was by using its chronically congested streets. But in 1863, those clever Victorians came up with a solution to ease congestion on the streets.
An incredible innovation that would transform the shape of London, the Underground.
And the Metropolitan line is where it all started. I'm in what was part of the original Underground service through the capital. And passing through here were steam engines belching out smoke, carrying gaslit, open-air carriages.
In 1863, the Metropolitan line opened as the world's first underground railway, with 7 stations connecting Paddington to Farringdon Street. In its first year, it carried 9.5 million passengers, and in its second, a staggering 12 million. But this underground wasn't exactly underground at all.
Stations like this were built using what's called cut and cover construction, which meant that the lines ran just beneath the surface. Effectively, they'd dig a big trench, lay the track, and then pop a roof back over the top. So we're not deep down here at all. But building these trains in drains was impossible without causing a huge amount of disruption on the streets above.
And that was a problem. What was needed was a way of digging underground tunnels without causing so much damage. The inventive Victorians came up with the answer.
Grab a torch so you can see everything.
Abandoned under Moorgate Station is a revolutionary piece of equipment, and taking me to see it is TfL engineer Omar Mohammed.
This is it.
Yep, great head shield.
When you compare this to kind of modern day tunnel boring machines,
Absolutely.
the technology involved in that, this might look quite simple, but it did the same thing just in Victorian times.
Exactly. It's the same principle used today.
The Great Head Shield was the tunnelling machine pioneered by the Brunel family. Each miner would dig out the earth from their chamber. The shield could then be propelled forward with jacks, and a cast iron lining put in its place to form the tunnel.
And these aren't the original cast iron
Yes,
lines?
exactly,
No.
yeah.
It's brilliant, isn't it?
Yeah.
This-
Hundreds of years old, yeah.
And they're still doing the job today.
Yeah.
The Great Head Shield is responsible for the first section of what we now call the Northern Line, the first proper tube line that was built by boring a tunnel rather than cutting a trench and putting a roof over the top.
By 1890, 5 tube lines transported millions across the city. In just under 30 years, with their world's first underground system, the Victorians had utterly changed London.
By the end of the 19th century, London had solved the problem of easing congestion on its streets by building the underground.
But it wasn't just about creating the tube. By the late 19th century, London had undergone the most intense period of construction in its history, and it was well on its way to becoming a modern city. But there was a price to pay for the creation of this new London.
Building it involved the demolition of a huge number of homes, which in turn contributed to a housing crisis that had become increasingly desperate.
As more roads and railway lines were built, thousands of Londoners were forced out into already overcrowded areas on the edge of the city, like the East End. By the late 1880s, places like Shoreditch and Whitechapel were crammed with people living in desperate conditions. Here, the Old Nickel had become London's most notorious slum. I'm meeting historian Hallie Rubenhold to find out more.
So we're looking at about 20 streets that made up the Old Nickel. And within those 20 streets, there were 653 households that contained 6,000 people.
That's huge.
Unbelievable. A very poor family might inhabit one room. So we're looking at 8, 9 people in a room of about 8 by 10 feet.
My goodness. I mean, what were sanitation conditions like?
Sanitation was absolutely terrible, and this is one of the reasons why people were getting sick and mortality was so high.
In the slum areas like the Old Nickel, the annual death rate was double the capital's average. But after 40 years under Queen Victoria, London had become the head of a global empire and was the richest and most prosperous city in the world.
By the end of the 1880s, London's population had grown to over 5 million, and estimates were that a quarter of them were living in poverty. But one man, Charles Booth, a social reformer, thought this must be a gross exaggeration. 1.25 million people couldn't possibly be living in that miserable state in the greatest city in the world. This was the heart of the British Empire, for goodness sake.
So Booth set out to assess what living conditions in London were really like, street by street. He produced an astonishing series of maps.
This is the descriptive map of London poverty.
So what do the colours mean?
The black is what Booth would have described as very poor, semi-criminal, and then we see we've got blue also, which is just a notch above that.
Where are we here?
Well, we are right here on Commercial Street.
We're in red at the moment. What's red?
Red is middle class, it's prosperous.
So it's all down the big main roads, but as soon as you get off the main road, we've got black.
Booth's maps were utterly groundbreaking in what they revealed about London in the 1880s. He discovered that in this immensely wealthy city, 1/3 of the capital's population was living in poverty. That's nearly 2 million people.
What's startling about this is just the degree of poverty it shows.
As the shocking extent of poverty in London was exposed, public pressure increased to fix this problem. And a series of infamous events were about to shine a light on the issue and leave a lasting legacy on the city.
When this map was produced, it was right in the middle of what were called the Whitechapel murders. The Whitechapel murders took place from 1888 to 1891. There were 11 murders, and 5 of those murders were committed by the person we've identified as Jack the Ripper.
Where we are right here?
Absolutely. In fact, we are drinking in the 10 Bells, which is where Mary Jane Kelly, the 5th victim, had a drink shortly before she was killed.
So what was their connection to Whitechapel?
Whitechapel was, you know, the last stop. It was where you sank at the very end of your life. And this is what happened to these women. This is why they were on the streets when they were killed.
So these are women who are victims of poverty before they ever became Ripper victims?
Absolutely, they were victims of poverty. Poverty is a massive problem in this city.
When news of Jack the Ripper's horrific crimes hit the headlines around the empire, the pitiful state of living conditions in London's East End became obvious to everyone. Something needed to be done.
And it was. From 1891, right across London, slums began to be knocked down, starting here with the Old Nickel. After decades of expansion and change, the London that emerged in 1900 was a very different city.
By the end of the 19th century, London had become the most influential and the most populated city on Earth. This staggering growth had been powered by industrialisation and the ingenuity of the Victorians. But in the first year of the 20th century, that chapter in the story of this city would come to an end.
The 2nd of February, 1901. London was the location for a momentous event in history. The funeral of Queen Victoria, by then the country's longest reigning monarch.
The procession's route through the capital was described by this newspaper as being packed and lined with the greatest multitude that any living person has seen in London. From on all sides, people poured towards the scene of the procession. The sound of wheels was silent. The streets resounded only with the tramping of feet.
Queen Victoria left behind a city unrivaled in power and influence.
It wasn't just the capital of Britain, it was the capital of the British Empire and of the British Commonwealth of Nations. 450 million people, a fifth of the planet's population, were ruled from here.
During the 64 years of Victoria's reign, London had undergone an astonishing transformation. It had grown from a city of just over 1.5 million people to a staggering 6.5 million. By 1901, the capital sprawled across a huge 120 square miles.
For the first time in its history, London had become the largest city in the world. It was a centre for international trade, the world's leading industrialised city. A hub of innovation, exploration, science and culture. And what Queen Victoria had started, her son, Edward VII, would continue.
Queen Victoria's son, the Prince of Wales, was crowned Edward VII at the ripe old age of 59, and he made Buckingham Palace his main residence.
As king, Edward made it his mission to modernise the monarchy, and in the process, he gave Britain's slightly grubby capital a little bit of its sparkle back.
Under King Edward, a new look for the city began to emerge, built in gleaming white Portland stone. This period, from 1901 to 1914, known as the Edwardian era, is responsible for some of London's most iconic sites: Admiralty Arch, the War Office, and the MI5 building.
The Edwardian era saw a luxurious new capital emerge. Across the West End, theatres sprang up, like the London Palladium and the Apollo. Department stores were open for business, like Harvey Nichols and Selfridges. And for the well-heeled who wanted to spend a night in town, you could book a room at the Savoy, the Ritz, or here at the Waldorf.
Opened in 1908, London's Waldorf epitomises Edwardian London. So there's no better place to meet up with an old friend, historian Dr. Fern Riddell.
Tell me about this rather lovely room we're sitting in.
Isn't it beautiful? This is the Palm Court at the Waldorf Hotel, and I love it because it is just the most amazing example of kind of Edwardian glamour and opulence.
Let's say we'd gone out into the street outside the Waldorf, first decade of the 20th century. What would we have seen that maybe we hadn't seen before?
You're going to see so much that you've never seen before. Motorised buses for the first time. Not only is the underground really taking off and becoming something that people use to get from where they're living to where they're working, but we're also seeing incredible advances in communication. So this is really when the telephone takes off. I mean, this is technology that is almost sci-fi for the Edwardians.
How were social attitudes changing in this period?
This time is the time of the suffragettes. You know, when you went out onto the street into London here, you'd have seen crowds of women marching with placards, being run down with horses by the police. And it just is the most powerful cultural moment that I think we see in the city in its history.
But the optimism, enthusiasm, and glamour of Edwardian London wasn't to last.
As the Edwardian era drew to a close, London found itself once again on the brink of a new age that would transform the capital. International events were about to sweep away much of what had gone before.
The First World War. It brought untold misery and sacrifice to Britain and the world, laying waste to vast swathes of Europe.
But the story of how it affected London specifically is less well known, and it's important because those 4¼ years did change London. The war may not have physically altered London's geography or its boundaries, but its impact and legacy changed London for generations to come. Even in the 21st century, Londoners are still living with many of the consequences of the First World War.
From the moment war was declared, at 11 p.m. on Tuesday the 4th of August 1914, London sprang into action.
There was a dramatic increase in manufacturing to satisfy the urgent need for huge numbers of munitions and weapons.
500,000 rifles and bayonets, 250,000 machine guns.
The area behind me is the Woolwich Arsenal, this 120-acre estate that's now being transformed into luxury flats was the site of the Royal Ordnance Factory, which increased its workforce from 10,000 to 75,000, all producing shells, artillery and gun carriages.
As the resources of the capital were all turned towards the war effort, house building virtually ceased. Instead, new munitions factories sprung up, almost overnight.
In every sense, this city became the strategic command centre of the British war effort against the Germans. And because of that, London became a prime target.
I'm meeting Alex Churchill, a First World War historian and author.
Alex, what was the effect of the First World War on London?
Nobody expected aerial warfare in the First World War, so the population of London are dragged into the war like never before. And then London's first hit by Zeppelin bombs in May 15.
The aerial bombing of London heralded a new type of warfare, one where civilians were the prime target.
They're coming into the West End, they're bombing the Strand, South London is being hit, North London is being hit, and the initial assumption that they would only hit military targets quickly goes away after the raids pick up.
How shocking would it have been for people at the time to be attacked like this?
I think if you want a modern analogy, you have to go with 9/11. You have to go with this utterly shocking, utterly unthought of attack. And everybody's at the theatre, people are home on leave, everyone's eating in the restaurants, having a night out, and suddenly a Zeppelin starts dropping bombs on the Strand. They probably have never seen a Zeppelin or never seen an aeroplane even, because they're not even invented till 10 years before the war. So to suddenly look up and hear the buzzing and feel the bombs dropping around you would be absolutely mind-blowing.
It must have felt like a science fiction nightmare.
Between 1915 and 1918, London experienced the full horror of modern aerial warfare, with around 30 bombing raids on the capital. But there was one raid on an unsuspecting corner of East London which shocked the city more than any other.
This memorial in Poplar commemorates the worst air raid of World War I. On the 13th of June 1917, 18 bombers come over London. 158 people are killed and more than 400 are wounded, and it's carnage. One of the bombs explodes in a school and killed 18 in all children. It hit the reception class, so most of the casualties are 5-year-olds.
Oh my goodness.
They're in a grave together, and it was decided that that would be fitting anyway for them to rest together. For London, this really is a hideous moment. The King and Queen sent a telegram to the parents as well, who'd lost their babies in this raid.
It really brings home the awfulness of war and its impact on the city when you have 18 small children dying.
This deadly raid on Poplar was just one tragedy for the capital, but sadly the war would bring many more.
More than 41,000 Londoners were killed and over 200,000 were injured. Those lucky enough to return came back to a London that had changed. They found an overcrowded city of some 7 million exhausted and often undernourished souls.
London's population was ill-equipped to face the next terrifying threat that was coming their way. 11 a.m., the 11th of November 1918, Armistice Day. The streets of London were packed with people celebrating the end of the First World War. It seemed like the bad times were over. But unbeknown to them, as they kissed and hugged, they were passing between them a deadly disease.
At the end of the First World War, troops coming back to London from the Western Front brought with them a strain of flu that was much more virulent than usual.
It was called the Spanish flu, and it was causing a global crisis.
Over the course of 18 months, an estimated 50 million people died from it. That's 3 times as many people as had died during the course of the whole war.
The flu had its most devastating effect on London's population when it struck in the late autumn of 1918. I'm meeting Carla Valentine at the Pathology Museum to find out more about its impact on the city.
Why, at the end of the First World War, do we have this epidemic?
At the time, I think with the most particularly virulent outbreak, it was because we were celebrating Armistice Day. And if you think about how the flu transmits, it's airborne, it's kissing and yawning and sneezing and hugging and touching with your hands. Everybody was doing a lot of that, and there were an awful lot of people in one place.
Weakened by 4.5 years of war, thousands were struck down within days.
This one in particular caused a very extreme reaction. It stopped their lungs from working, so they could be absolutely fine in the morning, catch the flu, and then by the end of the day, they were dead.
It's hard to imagine the chaos that the flu pandemic would have caused. I mean, think of the comparison. Last year, in the winter, flu broke out, and we were told there was an NHS in crisis, that hospitals were struggling to find beds to cope with the 4,000 cases of flu a day. And in the end, 320 people died nationally. But in 1919, in London alone, between 16 and 23,000 people died.
For Londoners, it was the worst epidemic in living memory. So many people had been affected by the virus that there was a shortage of gravediggers, and rumours spread that London was running out of coffins.
Mercifully, the outbreak came to an end in May 1919, and Londoners stoically got on with their lives. But spurred on by peace after the war to end all wars, London would undergo one of the most significant changes in its 2,000-year-old history. Over the next 20 years, London would become the largest it had ever been. Thanks to a brand new concept, the suburbs, the city would double in size.
But how and why did London undergo such a dramatic transformation in the 2 decades that followed the First World War? Well, behind me is the how. From 1919, the Metropolitan line extension pushed London's transport links out from the centre of the capital to what was then the suburbs. And it's places like here at Wembley that the idea of suburbia first took hold.
Suburbia was seen as the solution to the problem of a cramped and overcrowded London. With a population of more than 7 million people, the capital had to expand. And what was needed was affordable housing.
That's where the Metropolitan line came in. The controllers of the Met owned vast tracts of land along the course of the line as it radiated out through Baker Street in central London, through places like Harrow, Pinner, Ruislip, and where we are now in Wembley Park.
So from 1919 onwards, the Metropolitan Railway used the land they owned to build a string of housing estates close to the stations with hundreds of brand new homes.
What they needed was a clever way of selling them, so they came up with this, a magazine called Metroland, which sold a seductive dream of life far away from the industrialised, smoky heart of London. And if you flick through it, there are loads of adverts for beautiful homes at the edge of the countryside with every modern convenience.
The houses were designed to evoke the good old days of merry England and were built in a mock Tudor style.
According to Metroland, they were situated in the health-giving air of the open country, and you could pick up a 3-bedroom house for just £1,125.
Metroland was so successful that in just under 20 years, 800,000 people had moved to this new area of northwest London. The boundaries of the city were expanding.
That pattern of rapid urbanisation was being repeated all around London, in places like Watford, Harrow and Ealing. So much so that suburbia permanently changed the shape and size of London.
In the 20 years after the First World War, over 750,000 homes were built in outer London. Until in 1939, London's population hit its highest figure yet, a staggering 8.6 million people. The huge amount of development in the capital meant that it doubled in size and now stretched across a colossal 34 miles from Uxbridge in the west to Dartford in the east. It was an astonishing rate of growth, but it was getting out of control and had to be stopped.
Now, London's councils were determined that urban sprawl shouldn't gobble up the countryside around the city.
So a band of open space was introduced to stop the city expanding out any further. It was called the Green Belt.
The establishment of the Green Belt was a pivotal moment in London's history. It marks the point at which the boundaries of the city as we know them today were defined.
But London would not thrive for long in its newly established perimeter. Another war was on the way, and it would transform the city once again, beyond all recognition.
The 3rd of September 1939, the Second World War was declared. Bombing raids just over 20 years earlier had made war chiefs realise that London would again be a prime target. They feared that if the capital were destroyed, Britain would lose the war and as many as 4 million Londoners would be killed. Keeping them safe was critical. As the threat of bombing loomed, the government came up with something that would save the lives of thousands of Londoners. Anderson shelters.
Oh, look at this. I can just about stand up, but it's not very wide at all, is it? And this is for a family of 6. What a squeeze it would have been.
These simple corrugated metal structures were cheap to make and easy to build in backyards and gardens across the capital. And by late 1940, more than 2.25 million Londoners had access to one.
Susanna!
Hello.
Hello.
Careful.
I know, I wasn't built for this.
I'm meeting Blitz expert Joshua Levine to find out how these shelters protected Londoners.
These Anderson shelters must have been one of the most important structures of the war.
Oh, I really think they were. I mean, they're really safe. They don't look it, they just look like a bit of tin stuck up in the garden. But actually, unless you were hit directly by a bomb, this would save your life.
For the first year of the war, there were no bombs. But then, at 8 minutes past midnight on the 7th of September 1940, the first bomb of the Blitz dropped on the capital.
Pets could hear the sirens further out. They would start wailing. Then you would hear the bombs starting to drop. So where we are now, the house destroyed over in that direction, house destroyed over in that direction. You would have shrapnel, rubble.
On the first day of the Blitz alone, 2,000 Londoners were wounded or killed, with thousands of buildings and homes damaged or destroyed. But it was the first of many more to come.
So you had 57 consecutive nights of bombing on London. And you could imagine having to put up with that in here.
Joshua is taking me to Martello Street in East London, where he has uncovered an extraordinary story of 2 Londoners, which helps us understand the human cost of the bombing raids on the capital.
On the morning of 21st of September 1940, a high-explosive bomb blew up there. There was a couple called Joseph and Ida Rodway in number 11. They were in their Anderson shelter in the garden.
Right.
So they weren't physically damaged. The house, however, was basically wrecked. They didn't know what to do.
Ida was the sole carer of her elderly husband, Joseph, who was blind and suffering from dementia. With their home destroyed, penniless and without support from the government, she was overwhelmed. Consumed by anxiety over her and her husband's future, Ida was driven to an act of desperation.
One morning, Ida got up, she walked into the room with a cleaver, and she cut his throat. She killed him. All she could think of to do was to actually end it for him, and effectively end it for herself at the same time.
Just so horrific.
It's absolutely horrifying, and this sort of unbelievable personal story gives you a sense of the bigger picture, of what actually socially was happening at this time.
Ida's fateful story is just one of thousands of tragedies caused by the Second World War bombing of the capital. These raids were meticulously documented, and the records are stored here at the London Metropolitan Archives.
The result is an astonishing selection of 110 maps, which reveal the extent of the damage in painstaking detail. What's laid out on the table here is a selection of those maps that show the city down the Thames to the East End. And what they reveal is both fascinating and terrifying in equal measure.
Each individual map has been colour-coded by hand. The colours show the degree of damage sustained by each building.
Black means total destruction. So if you look here in Southwark, London Bridge, and really startlingly so in Docklands, totally destroyed. Purple's not much better, damaged beyond repair. On one night, on the 29th of December 1940, we know that 64,000 incendiary bombs were dropped on London. And a huge swathe between St Paul's and Islington was set alight.
The Second World War bombing campaign is one of the most catastrophic events in all of London's history. More than 30,000 Londoners lost their lives. The capital experienced destruction on a scale never seen before. Nearly 2 million homes across London were eventually damaged or destroyed. The capital was a bombed-out shell of its former self. It would spend the next 2 decades struggling to recover. But London was not giving up and would reinvent itself once more.
1948. London lies in ruins, savaged by the ravages of war. But a new chapter in the story of London was about to begin. Immigrants from the Commonwealth arrived to help rebuild the capital. And a new, diverse city emerged from the ashes. This growing population needed more housing, but the Greenbelt meant that London could no longer expand outwards. It was forced to go up. In the next 20 years, the city's skyline would become unrecognisable. This period also heralded a massive transformation in the east of the city, on the Isle of Dogs.
Throughout the story of London, from the Romans to the Tudors and into the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries, the wealth and influence of our capital has utterly depended on the river that runs through its heart. And the docks have always played a crucial role. But in the 1960s, everything changed.
For the first time, goods began to be transported around the world in containers. And these colossal new container ships were just too big and too heavy to negotiate the bends of the River Thames to reach the capital. It spelled disaster for the docks on the Isle of Dogs.
As the docks closed one by one, the local economy completely collapsed. Between 1967 and 1981, 60% of the area that was once the jewel in the crown of Britain's trading empire became derelict.
But just as it had done many times before, London picked itself up and started all over again. I'm meeting historian Leo Hollis to find out how.
What you get in 1979 is Margaret Thatcher. She had a brand new vision of what the city should be. It was no longer a capital of industrialisation, of industries. It was now going to be a brand new kind of city. It was an attempt to transform London from an old imperial city into a global city.
This coincided with a change in how the economy worked. For centuries, the City of London had been the capital's financial centre, but the international banks were outgrowing the old buildings.
They needed large trading floors, and one of the places they looked almost immediately was in the Docklands.
In 1981, the fortunes of this derelict corner of London were transformed when the Isle of Dogs became one of the biggest building projects in Europe, and Canary Wharf was born.
Right across 97 acres here. It was a developer's free-for-all. And Londoners all around watched as a titanic New York-style office development emerged from out of the dust.
This 235-metre, 50-storey tower at 1 Canada Square was the first. and right up until 2010, it was London's tallest building.
Oh boy, this is high. And from up here, you can see London's new city in the east in all its glory. It is amazing. But back in the 1980s, this stretch of the Docklands was thought of as remote and inaccessible, an undesirable place even, but not anymore.
30 years after it was conceived, the rebuilding of the Docklands has completely transformed London. It pushed the city east and turned the capital into the world's leading financial centre, with a workforce set to double in size over the next 10 years.
That will only be possible because of a massive £15 billion project that will generate the biggest transformation of the city since the Second World War.
This is the new Liverpool Street Station. It's one of 10 state-of-the-art stations and a vital hub on what will be London's newest transport link, Crossrail.
It's being built to solve the same problem London faced back in the 19th century when the first tubes were built: congestion. Last year, some 1.37 billion journeys were made by tube, but it's still not big enough. In a city that's continuing to grow, we need more tunnels.
Crossrail will make it possible to transport an additional 1.5 million people across the capital every day.
And this is where it's all happening.
The scale of this project is truly epic. 26 miles of brand new tunnels built 42 metres below London. But these miles of newly dug tunnels have given us something else. An unexpected and extraordinary window on the history of London. Working on the construction site, archaeologists have uncovered evidence from Roman times that takes us all the way back to the very birth of London, when this extraordinary city
was just a small Roman settlement on the banks of the River Thames.
We've come a long way in our journey from Roman London. We've seen the city bitterly fought over to become the country's capital, where power-hungry kings built extraordinary buildings that still dominate the skyline today.
As London grew ever bigger, it became the global capital of the British Empire, only to be rocked to its very foundations by 2 devastating wars. And yet, London emerged from the ashes as the monumental modern city we know today. This is the story of London.